The clock in our front room had stopped at 11 minutes past 9, though I did not notice it until much later. What I remember first is the sound of sleet against the window and the small wet mark my granddaughter left on the floor where snow melted from the hem of her dress. She stood inside the door with both hands closed around the strings of her black bonnet. She was 27 years old, married for nearly 6 years, and I had never seen her look so certain and so frightened at the same time. Before that night was over, she would refuse to go back to her husband. Before the next evening, the bishop would send for me. And before that week ended, I would have to decide whether keeping peace was the same thing as doing right. My name is Mahlan. I have been Amish all my life, and I have been a husband, a father, and now a grandfather long enough to know that families can hide their deepest trouble behind very ordinary doors. I tell these stories because time has a way of showing a man which silences protected people and which silences only protected appearances. As you listen, I would like you to consider something for me. When does patience become surrender, and when does keeping a family together begin to cost too much? You may leave your thoughts below, and if these quiet memories mean something to you, you are welcome to stay with me. My granddaughter's name was Miriam. She had always been the child who noticed what others missed. When she was 6, she found a sparrow stunned beneath the kitchen window and sat beside it in the grass until it flew. When she was 12, she could tell which cow was sick before anyone else saw it. When she married Jacob, she was 21, old enough to know her own mind, though perhaps not yet old enough to understand how difficult it can be to keep that mind when everyone around you praises obedience more than honesty. Jacob was not known as a cruel man. That matters because most serious trouble does not begin with a man everyone fears. It begins with a man everyone trusts, a man who works hard, keeps his tools in order, speaks softly during church, and believes that being respected means he must never be questioned inside his own home. He was a good carpenter. His joints were clean, his tables level, and his barn doors hung straight. People said a man who worked with that much care would surely care for a wife the same way. For the first years, Miriam said little against him. We saw them on Sundays. We saw them at weddings and frolics. She brought pies to my wife, Ruth, and helped wash dishes without being asked. Jacob spoke for both of them when plans were made. At the time, I took that for steadiness. An old man must be honest about the things he failed to see, or his wisdom is only vanity dressed in gray hair. The trouble that brought Miriam to our door had been growing for more than a year. Jacob had begun deciding which relatives she could visit and how long she could remain. He kept the household money in a locked drawer, though she managed the food, the mending, and nearly every need of their 2 small children. When she asked for money, he wanted an account of every penny. When she disagreed, he reminded her that a wife was to submit. That word can be spoken gently and still be used like a closed fist. I do not say that lightly. Scripture has carried me through graveside winters and long nights beside sick beds. But any holy word can be made unholy when a person uses it to erase another soul. Miriam had tried to speak with him privately. She had tried waiting until he was rested. She had tried saying less. She had tried saying nothing. Then on the night she came to us, Jacob had demanded that she return to their room and stop resisting him whenever he claimed the rights of a husband. I will not dress that moment in details that do not belong to me. It is enough to say that Miriam believed her no should have been heard, and Jacob believed marriage had taken that word from her. She left after putting the children to sleep. She walked nearly 2 miles through sleet because she was afraid that if she waited until morning, she would lose the courage to leave. Ruth opened the door before Miriam knocked a second time. My wife took one look at her and led her toward the stove. I stayed near the table. There are moments when a man's presence can feel like protection, and moments when it can feel like another wall. I did not yet know which I was. Miriam removed her bonnet. Her hair was damp along the temples. Ruth wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and set warm milk before her. For several minutes, Miriam watched the steam rise without touching the cup. Then she looked at me. She said only one sentence. "Grandpa, I said no, and he told me no wife has that right." I have heard louder words in my life. I have heard trees split in winter and horses scream after injury. That sentence was quieter than either, but it changed the shape of the room. I wish I could tell you I answered at once. I did not. I had been raised in a world where husbands led, wives followed, and private matters stayed private unless the church was invited in. My first thought was not noble. My first thought was that this would become known. My second was that Jacob would be angry. My third was that the children were still in his house. Only after those thoughts came the one that should have come first. My granddaughter was asking whether she belonged to herself. Ruth did not hesitate as long as I did. She moved her chair beside Miriam and placed one hand over hers. No speech, no judgment, just a hand that said she was not alone. I have often thought that women know the difference between comfort and permission better than men do. Miriam did not need us to decide her life before midnight. She needed a locked door, a warm place, and the assurance that no one would carry her back. I told her she could stay. The words came slowly, but they came. Ruth prepared the small downstairs room where our youngest son once slept. I went to the barn, not because there was work to do, but because my thoughts needed cold air around them. The lantern threw a narrow yellow circle over the packed earth. Our old mare turned her head when I entered, then returned to her hay. Animals do not ask a man whether his beliefs are consistent. They only notice whether his hands are calm. Mine were not. I stood beside the stall and remembered my own first years of marriage. I had never thought of myself as a hard husband. I worked, I provided, I did not drink, I did not raise my hand to Ruth. For many years I believed those facts completed the measure of a good man. But I remembered nights when Ruth had been tired and I treated her tiredness as inconvenience. I remembered decisions I announced rather than discussed. I remembered how often people praised me for the peace in our home when much of that peace had been purchased by her silence. A man can go 70 years without calling himself cruel and still discover that kindness required more listening than he gave. Near midnight, I went back inside. Miriam was asleep, though her cup remained untouched. Ruth sat near the stove, mending nothing, the needle still between her fingers. We understood that morning would bring questions. In a close community, trouble travels quickly even when no one carries it. Before sunrise, Jacob arrived. He did not pound on the door. He stood on the porch with snow on his shoulders and anger held so tightly that his voice was almost polite. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He wanted his wife returned. He said the matter belonged within their marriage. He said I was weakening his authority by sheltering her. He said the children needed their mother. All of those statements contained pieces of truth. That is what makes some wrong arguments difficult. The children did need their mother. Marriage did deserve privacy. Authority did have a place. But none of those truths gave him ownership of her body, her conscience, or her fear. I told him Miriam would decide when she returned. He stared at me as if age had made me foolish. Perhaps it had made me late rather than foolish. I had needed most of a lifetime to understand that peace built on fear is only quietness. Jacob left without entering the house. By midday, one of the ministers came. He was careful and uneasy. He did not accuse Miriam directly, but his questions leaned in one direction. Had she obeyed her husband? Had she spoken respectfully? Had she considered the damage of leaving? Had she prayed? I listened until I noticed what was missing. No one had yet asked what Jacob had demanded, how long Miriam had been afraid, or whether he had listened when she said no. That omission told me more than the questions. The next morning, word came that the bishop wished to see me. The message was simple. I was to come after the noon meal to the harness shop behind his son's farm. I had been called before for ordinary matters. A fence disagreement, a boy who wanted to buy a tractor with rubber tires, a family considering a move. This felt different. The road was frozen hard beneath the buggy wheels. Bare branches scraped the gray sky. I passed Jacob's place and saw laundry hanging stiff on the line. 2 small shirts moved in the wind. For a moment I nearly turned in. I thought of the children and of the years it can take a family to recover from 1 week of public conflict. Then I thought of Miriam's wet hem and the way she had held her bonnet strings. I kept going. The bishop sat at a workbench with his hands folded over a piece of brown leather. He was older than Jacob and younger than me. I had known him since he was a boy. He was not a wicked man. I want that understood. People often imagine that injustice must be carried out by monsters. More often it is carried out by decent people defending a system they believe cannot survive honest questions. He spoke of order. He spoke of marriage vows. He spoke of the danger of grandparents interfering between husband and wife. He reminded me that Miriam had not first brought her complaint through the proper steps. I answered that frightened people do not always move through trouble in the proper order. He said Jacob denied harming her. I said harm is not always measured by bruises. He said a husband has responsibilities and a wife has responsibilities. I agreed. Then I asked whether a wife's responsibility included surrendering the right to refuse. The bishop did not answer quickly. The harness shop smelled of oil, leather, and cold iron. Outside, a horse stamped once against the frozen ground. I could feel the old habits inside me asking for an easier ending. I could apologize. I could promise to counsel Miriam. I could send her home with a warning to Jacob and allow the community to call the matter settled. Many conflicts are ended that way. The stronger person is told to be gentler. The frightened person is told to be patient. Everyone goes home relieved except the one who was not heard. The bishop finally told me that marriage could not survive if wives rejected their husbands whenever they wished. I told him marriage could not remain holy if husbands believed a vow erased a wife's will. My voice was not loud. At my age, a man should not need volume to know what he means. I also told him that Miriam was an adult woman, not a runaway child, and that my home would remain open to her. That was the moment I understood why he had called me rather than her. Miriam's refusal could be described as emotion. Mine could not be dismissed so easily. I was a grandfather, a landowner, a man who had sat through decades of church meetings and buried elders older than the bishop. The same community that had taught women to defer had also taught people to listen when an old man spoke slowly. I do not take pride in that advantage. I only regret how often authority believes pain after it is repeated by someone authority already respects. The bishop asked whether I was prepared for the consequences of defiance. I said I was more concerned about the consequences of obedience without conscience. That ended the meeting. No formal judgment came that day. He told me the ministers would visit both households. I returned home beneath a sky already darkening before supper. Miriam was at the kitchen table peeling apples with Ruth. The children were with Jacob's sister, where they were safe and cared for. Miriam looked toward me when I entered, but I did not give her a report in front of everyone. I removed my coat, washed my hands, and sat down. There was a steadiness in ordinary work that evening. Apple skin curled into the bowl. The stove ticked as it cooled. Ruth measured cinnamon with the edge of a spoon. No one pretended the trouble had passed. Still, the house did not feel broken. It felt honest. Over the next days, the matter widened. Some believed Miriam had shamed her husband. Some believed I had encouraged rebellion. A few women came quietly with bread, jars of broth, or sewing that did not need doing. They never said why. Men were slower to visit. When they did, they spoke about weather before circling toward the question beneath it. Could a wife refuse? Could a husband be corrected in matters no outsider witnessed? Could a marriage remain a marriage if authority had limits? Those questions frightened people because they were not only about Miriam and Jacob. They entered every home. They sat at every table. A rule feels simple until someone asks who carries its cost. Jacob met with the ministers twice. Miriam met with them once, with Ruth beside her. I was not in the room. She later told me they listened more carefully than she expected and less carefully than she needed. That is often how change begins, not with justice complete, but with a silence interrupted. Jacob wanted reconciliation, though at first he seemed to mean restoration of the old arrangement. Miriam did not ask for punishment. She asked that he admit her refusal mattered, that household money no longer be used to control her, and that counseling continue before she returned. Those were not extravagant demands. Yet to a man accustomed to unquestioned authority, equality can feel like humiliation. The weeks that followed were not tidy. There was no single meeting where every heart changed. Jacob grew angry, then ashamed, then quiet. He spent time with an older married couple from another district, people known for firmness without spectacle. Miriam visited the children daily and brought them to our house on Sundays. She did not speak against their father in front of them. I watched that with respect. Protecting children does not require teaching them to hate half of themselves. Winter softened. Water began running beneath the ice along the ditch. One afternoon, Jacob came to our farm alone. He stood near the woodpile while I split kindling. He did not apologize to me, and I did not need him to. He asked whether Miriam had said she would ever return. I told him she had not closed the door, but he could not walk through it carrying the same beliefs that drove her out. He looked toward the house for a long time. A younger version of me might have filled the silence with instruction. Age had taught me that some truths need room to become a man's own. He left after a few minutes. 3 days later, Miriam agreed to meet him at the home of the older couple. Months passed before she returned to their house. Even then, she did not return because the bishop ordered it or because neighbors stopped whispering. She returned because Jacob had begun to understand that being a husband did not make every desire righteous, and because she saw enough change to choose the marriage again. Choice mattered. Without it, returning would only have been another form of refusal denied. Their marriage did not become perfect. No marriage does. Jacob remained proud. Miriam remained cautious. Trust came back like grass after a hard winter, uneven at first, with bare patches that took longer. But there were changes visible even to those outside their home. Miriam handled the household money with him. She visited Ruth without asking permission. When decisions were discussed, Jacob no longer answered before she could speak. These may sound like small things. A long life has taught me that freedom often enters quietly. It looks like a key shared, a question asked, a door no longer watched. Years later, when my hands had begun to shake and Jacob had streaks of gray in his beard, he helped repair the steps to our porch. We worked most of the morning without mentioning that winter. Near noon, he paused with the hammer resting on his knee. He did not give me a grand confession. He simply said he had once mistaken being obeyed for being loved. I will not count that as the one sentence from another person that carries this story, because I have already given you Miriam's words as they were spoken that night. Still, I tell you the meaning of what he admitted, because a man should be allowed to grow beyond the worst belief he once defended. Miriam stayed married to him. That was her decision, not proof that the danger had been small. Some people leave and are right to leave. Some remain and build something new. The moral cannot be that every troubled marriage must be preserved, nor that every wounded marriage must end. The truth is quieter. No marriage can be healed by removing one person's right to choose. When I think back to the night she arrived, I do not remember myself as brave. I remember being slow. I remember how close I came to protecting the name of the family instead of the person standing inside it. Old age has not made me certain about everything. It has made me suspicious of any teaching that asks the weaker person to carry all the sacrifice. We Amish speak often of submission. We speak of humility, order, patience, and peace. These can be beautiful things when they are chosen freely and practiced by everyone. But humility demanded only from women is not humility. Patience demanded only from the afraid is not patience. Peace maintained by one person's silence is not peace. That is what 70 years have taught me. A vow should make two people safer in each other's hands, not less free to speak. A husband is not made smaller when his wife has a voice. He is given the chance to become someone she can trust without fear. And a grandfather does not protect a family by forcing its trouble back behind a closed door. Sometimes he protects it by opening his own. I still have the old clock from that night. Ruth had it repaired years ago, and it hangs in the same place, though the house is quieter now. Whenever I notice the hands pass 11 minutes after 9, I think of melted snow on the floor and a young woman waiting to learn whether her family would hear her. I am grateful that eventually we did. I only wish we had taught her sooner that she never needed our permission to belong to herself. If this story has stayed with you, you are welcome to subscribe and sit with me again. And I would like to know your answer to the question I asked at the beginning. When a family tells someone to keep the peace, how can we tell whether they are asking for patience or asking for silence? I read what you share. At my age, I have learned that listening is not the smallest thing we do for one another. Sometimes it is the beginning of everything.